Okay, thanks everybody for joining today. I'm Derek Wilson, Senior Sustainable Development Manager at Transport for London, where I lead the Sustainable Development team working across a development pipeline worth £10 billion across the capital. We also have a existing portfolio of about 2,000 properties, so quite a large property owner within London. We actually own about 5,700 acres, which not a lot of people know about, but we're currently working to deliver a substantial portfolio and really implement best practice with respect to sustainability. And we're here today just to kind of run you through our overall approach. Just for those who aren't aware, TfL runs the transport network in London. That includes services like buses, trains, the London Underground, which obviously everybody knows about, and of course our cycle share schemes. So with respect to London's challenges, we've obviously got economic, social, and environmental challenges that we're dealing with. Variables include the bottom line and cash flows. So when it comes to our property estate, we're really looking to hopefully deliver a property estate that helps generate revenue that we can then reinvest back into the transport system. We've also got social challenges across the city, as does every city around the world, and environmental challenges. Some are specific to London, some are kind of global, and we're really trying to get to grips with those today. And what ultimately that kind of frames is our thinking around sustainability. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see that we really do take a bottom line approach. We kind of think about those social challenges, economic challenges, and environmental challenges is not necessarily different things, but very much as one and the same thing, because they really do impact across each other. And that's one of the key themes you'll kind of see throughout the presentation, is that by joining up that thinking and actually thinking not about these issues independently, but holistically, that's a really kind of key way that we found to unlock additional financial value by considering the environmental and social side of things as well. So moving on to the next slide, just a bit more detail. On the economic side, challenges that London has, we've got about 70,000 new citizens coming into London each year, and the city's projected to reach a population of 10.5 million people by 2041. And to accommodate that growing population, we also need about 66,000 new homes each year. As of the third quarter of 2018, we were looking at around 39,000 homes being delivered, and that's actually even dropped since then. So we're not producing anywhere near the number of homes required, and as a result, that's creating a lot of upward pressure on the market, leading to an affordability challenge that's affecting Londoners across the city. On the next slide, one of the other challenges we've got is employment growth. Similar to the housing issue, we've got about 88,000 new jobs each year, and that means that about 6.9 million people will need to be in occupations by 2041. That translates to us needing about 1.8 million square feet of new net employment space per year. And yet, when you look at it, we've actually been losing about 9 million square feet per year due to conversions. So a lot of office buildings are being converted into residential units, and we're losing employment space, and we're not delivering very much employment space in return. So we're losing employment space on net, even though we need to actually be adding it. So again, we're putting pressure on the existing market. With respect to social challenges in public health, about 9,000 Londoners are dying prematurely each year due to air toxicity, and about 50% of that air pollution is coming from street level transport. So, like a lot of cities in the world, we're really grappling with the pollution issue, and we've introduced a bunch of measures, but it's really something that we do want to kind of be mindful of and take seriously. Moving on, we've got 27% of Londoners living in poverty after housing costs are considered. And 1 in 10 households living in fuel poverty. And obviously that's a really astonishingly high rate. For 1 in 4 to be living in poverty after you take housing costs into consideration, that's really quite substantial, and something that I think just goes to the fact that the housing market is so pressurized that housing costs are literally pushing people into poverty. On the next slide, we've got environmental challenges. So green infrastructure is a good example. We've got 47% of London being covered in green space, and yet almost half of Londoners have poor access to parks. So that kind of green space is distributed very poorly, and there are a lot of areas which are very, very gray within the city. So it's really, how do we balance that out a little bit and make green infrastructure accessible to everybody? The typical one, GHG emissions, everybody's, kind of grappling with this issue globally. And while our GHG emissions are falling, they're not falling fast enough to meet our national and international targets. And you can kind of see a few trajectories there. So suffice it to say, if we want to stay on track, and we do need to stay on track, the mayor's made several commitments to that effect, as has TfL. We really do need to kind of increase our effort and be in a leadership position amongst the sector to show how it gets done. And the last one, and obviously this one's a little bit of a more recent one, but not something that's on absolutely everybody's radar and has been certainly really impacting us around the world, is COVID. So that comes with it a whole host of different challenges which span the triple bottom line. Economically, there are a lot of people that have been impacted. And with significant job losses and economic security really being questioned, there's a huge issue there. But how we support small business and indeed medium and large enterprises, how we create jobs, and how we give people the security they need economically so that they can lead fulfilling lives. Socially, obviously creating a lot more challenges in addition to that. And then finally, on the environmental side, we've also got quite a few different variables that are going to be thrown up in the air around this. So for instance, if public transport can no longer carry as many people as is the case, and we do need to have people taking alternative modes of transport, is that going to result in increased emissions because more people are driving, or is that going to are emissions going to decrease because people are getting out of cars, starting to walk, because walking and cycling is suddenly a more attractive and well-resourced option? Where does that balance play out? Now, of course, it's going to be different for each city, but it's something to think about. And kind of bottom line, when you take all these things together, whether it's COVID or any of these other issues, ultimately what we've got is a convergence of pressures, and that is creating a bit of a challenge for London. And it really begs the question, how are we going to unlock all of this? So if we move on to London's future, we've got a really good case study actually globally, which is the MTR. Now, this system is basically it's an approach to developing property developments around transport stations as you're delivering transport infrastructure. And what the model kind of illustrates is that you can actually use that property development revenue and profit to essentially pay for the transport system. Quite often when we deliver big infrastructure projects, we use government debt, borrowing, so on and so forth, and then hope to repay it after a long period of time. This model instead sees transit nodes developed locally, with the Transport Authority kind of taking ownership of those assets and using that property development related revenue to help pay for the transport. So it essentially becomes a financially sustainable system that doesn't require external revenues. And what we at TfL are trying to do is do the same thing, but retroactively. So right now we've got developments across more than 30 sites. The initial tranche of developments is going to be looking at about 10,000 homes, and we'll have many more in the pipeline thereafter. The aim there really, as I said, is to deliver development, generate revenues, and use that to help cover off the transport system. And here are a couple of our core drivers. As you can see, we really structure on the triple bottom line. And then we look to maximize homes and facilitate jobs. We promote healthy streets, which is a placemaking based approach to sustainable transport. We also want to promote a good public transport experience, and then, design excellence as well. And all that kind of facilitates that long-term revenue to the business and providing us with that revenue stream so we can reinvest in our transport system. So going on to the next, this is a really good example of a project that we are currently working on. This is a town center called Morden. It's in South London, and I think we skipped a few slides there. In any event, I'll move on. Okay, so sorry, going back. Yeah, so sustainability in TfL, looking at the, when we first started the process of trying to figure out where to look in terms of best practice, we did a bit of a survey throughout London and internationally, looked at companies that were really delivering exemplary performance on the issue of sustainability. And two of the ones that came out were Crown Estate and British Land. There were many more, it's worth adding. And we tried to figure out what the commonality was there, and we found that the property companies that consider sustainability through the lens of performance and taking a performance-focused approach were really the ones that were most successful. So we went on to develop a framework, which is on the next slide, that shows a series of objectives, which are kind of premised on that performance-focused approach. And that framework has 6 key objectives, which are to create a robust framework, but one that's adaptable to individual projects. We want one that allows TfL to take control of our sustainability outcomes through the supply chain and make sure our development partners are aligned with our objectives when we go to deliver housing. We also want to set a consistent performance baseline across all of our projects. And what that means is that day in, day out, we are achieving a consistently high standard of performance across all the different indicators that we want to deliver against. But we also pair that with a market-leading aspiration for each of those indicators. And what that does is it essentially creates a performance band that we can work within. And that allows us a bit of latitude and the ability to achieve a better balance across the triple bottom line. So moving on to the next slide, this is kind of an illustration of our 9 dimensions. This is the overall framework that we have adopted. So the Sustainable Development Framework, which TfL developed throughout 2019 and is now rolling out comprehensively, contains 9 dimensions, and those include economic dimensions, specifically sustainable revenue, infrastructure delivery, and economic development. On the environmental side, we have green infrastructure, healthy streets, and building performance. And on social, we've got health and well-being, engagement and inclusion, and livable communities. So we can move on to the next one. Just at a slightly more strategic level, we've got a series of rating systems that we've adopted to help measure our sustainability performance. First and foremost, we've got the home quality mark. So that is essentially the BREEAM or LEED equivalent for residential properties within the UK. We've also got BREEAM, which is essentially the same thing as LEED, but for commercial properties in the UK. And we've also been looking at a series of pilots, which we're exploring currently, and those include pilots such as the well building standard, passive house, and even the living building challenge in certain cases. So moving on, just to describe those dimensions in a bit more detail, the first dimension is sustainable revenue. So within that, you've got things like capital receipts, long-term financial returns, and life cycle costing. So things like IRR would be playing into that. We've also got infrastructure delivery. So this would be infrastructure delivered as part of the developments we build. And this is really just to capture their capital value and the value they bring to the business. So in the UK, this is kind of referred to as hypothecated value, covers off a whole range of different types of infrastructure. And then on the economic development side, we've got things like good work standards, responsible procurement, and promoting local jobs and training. Moving on to the environmental side of things, we've got building performance. So that kind of includes all of your typical bits that you'd ordinarily associate with sustainability, like energy, carbon, water, and waste. We've then got healthy streets, which, as I mentioned, it's kind of a proprietary TfL approach to delivering sustainable transport through a placemaking based approach, and that has been adopted London-wide. It's part of the Mayor's transport strategy and something that we really truly do try and implement across the board. And then finally, green infrastructure, which is looking more at urban greening, things like biodiversity net gain and runoff rates, so resilience in terms of stormwater and flooding. Moving on to the social side, we've got health and well-being. So again, that's pretty straightforward and standard, although health and well-being, our thinking around it is, of course, evolving. We've also got a dimension on engagement and inclusion, so that talks about things like diversity, community engagement, whether or not we're actually taking care to engage with and minimize impacts on the communities we operate in as we're developing, and also make sure that the developments we deliver, work for those communities. And then finally, we've got livable communities. So that's looking at the provision of different social infrastructure that needs to be in place for a community to really thrive. And that would include things like affordable housing, social services, and education. The list kind of goes on. And this is just a kind of a small sampling of the kinds of things that we look at. But with respect to the social bit, our industry is obviously really struggling to grapple with this issue. We at RICS have obviously been kind of interrogating this, and social value has come on the radar of this organization, as well as many others, and really just trying to bottom out what a good approach to social impact is and how it should be defined and measured, is very much a subject of discussion, debate, and we're participating actively in that. So just to kind of summarize that on the next slide, we've got the overall Sustainable Development Framework, which includes the triple bottom lines, the dimensions, and against each of those we have a whole series of KPIs. Those alongside the sustainability ratings that we've got kind of form the Sustainable Development Framework. And as I mentioned previously, we've got kind of two elements that fall off the back of that, which is our baseline target and our aspirational target, and you can kind of see those to the right. So for each project, what we'll do is we'll kind of set a baseline and an aspiration. So we're consistently, as I said, hitting minimum targets, and we're ideally doing even better than that. And that range between those 2 points gives us some latitude to make strategic decisions. So in terms of how that actually operates in practice, if you move on to the next slide, we've got what we call performance optimization briefs, and these are ideally delivered before REBA 1, and they don't really have relevance once you've gotten too far into the process. So they really do need to be done up front. But what they do in terms of the output is they assess opportunities and constraints. They identify potential best practices that could be implemented along with cost-benefit analysis. And then they set out relevant interventions and targets for the design team that they ought to be considering. And the benefit of that is that you're essentially looking to optimize sustainability performance from the outset, but you're able to do it in a commercially viable manner. And I really want to emphasize this point, is that if you don't take a look at sustainability early on, if you don't really take a view of what can we do here, what are the best practices we want to implement, what is the brief for the project team with respect to sustainability, and actually take some time to step back and look at that critically, it really does get to a point wherein you will get too far along in the process that making those decisions either won't be very effective or they will be very expensive. And there's a lot of I think misconceptions around the cost of sustainability. I hear all the time from professionals in the industry, and in particular quantity surveyors and cost consultants, that undertaking sustainability measures is too expensive. It ruins viability. It prevents positive financial returns and makes it really difficult to deliver sustainability outcomes unless you want to be losing money. And that's just simply not the case. But the difference is that if you don't get it in early, that does become the truth. And that's why it's so essential at the outset of a project to really figure out what you want to be achieving with respect to sustainability and make tactical decisions about what you're going to do so that you can do so in a commercially viable manner. And you can see there just an example of a kind of optimization brief that we've done. So we typically do one optimization briefs for each of the dimensions. That would be one for the healthy street side of things. And that kind of illustrates the type of report that we end up producing for each of the 9 dimensions. And we produce that right at the outset of the project. So we've got plenty of clarity and content for the product team as to what we want to be achieving. Now, moving on to stage 2, we've got performance specification, and this is really for when we go out to tender. So, translating that optimization brief, we then look to specify a series of performance targets. So all those key performance indicators that fall within those categories of the SDF, we put that baseline and aspirational target in that tender document. And what that allows us to do is actually use the competitive tendering process to get our supply chain to really start pushing on some of these areas. So, for example, we'll give a 5 to 10% weighting of the bid score on sustainability, and that score is calculated on the basis of the degree to which the supplier is willing to push for the aspirational. So if they go for just the minimum on everything and are only committing to delivering our minimum, they will basically get a score of 0 because they're just meeting the basic requirements. Conversely, if they're going all the way to the aspirational end of the spectrum and saying we're going to deliver against every KPI you want to see happen, they get 100%. And what that's actually done is driven our supply chain to deliver better outcomes. And as it turns out, when we start doing that, and again, getting it in early, being clear with the supply chain about what we want, they're able to deliver it without any cost uplift. And we're seeing some really extraordinary results coming in as a result of that. On a number of recent procurements, we've actually had contractors and development partners propose schemes that achieve globally unprecedented performance in certain areas. And that's purely because we've been clear at the front as to what we want to see, and we've enabled the supply chain to deliver that. That's an example of the healthy street specification. So, in that prior slide, we looked at the optimization brief. This is what that translates into. So we've basically set out a series of targets for each of the 10 indicators in the healthy streets approach. So that basically provides crystal clarity, really, to our supply chain, and that specification right there actually went into a bid document. So moving on, we've got the performance review and reporting, and as with so many things, you can have the best intentions in the world, but if you don't follow it up and kind of monitor that it's actually getting delivered, it doesn't really mean much. So what we tend to look to do is at the end of each design stage, we audit the scheme's projected performance against all the indicators that we've pulled together and all the targets that we've set. And we kind of use that to understand where we might be overperforming, and in those cases we can go out and kind of shout about it. Also where we're underperforming, so that where there is kind of action needed to get to the position that we want to. And then we look to provide advice to the product teams about what they need to do to kind of get the product in line with expectations, and indeed, even if they are kind of meeting our minimums, where there are opportunities for improvement that are kind of cost effective and commercially viable. And that kind of provides a bit of an illustration as to what the performance dashboard could look like. We've actually got a much more complicated system these days, but that's kind of gives you a bit of a flavor. So driving financial value, just moving on to the next section. So we've done a bit of a case study on low carbon energy in this particular case, and this has actually flowed out of one of our optimization briefs on building performance. So this is one of the 9 dimensions, and doing kind of a narrow deep dive on one particular section within that. That particular building performance optimization brief has about 16 sections. So this is 1/16 of one of the 9 optimization briefs on our projects, but it gives a really good illustration as to our process, I think, and also kind of helps illustrate why this kind of work is helpful in terms of coming up with a commercially attractive solution that also drives triple bottom line and sustainability benefits. So what we did is kind of at the outset, we looked sorry, if you could go back to the previous slide. What we tried to do is look at a series of options and do a comprehensive options appraisal on energy systems. And one of the things that we've actually found is that quite often when you know, our profession and related professions, architects, engineers, etc., go to do an options appraisal, they tend to default to a standard set of a couple options when they already kind of know the predetermined answer, and they just do a kind of back the envelope kind of cursory evaluation of those and say, oh yes, it's as we suspected, this is the right answer, and the other two aren't viable for reasons X, Y, and Z. That really misses the point, I think, because there's so much happening in this space, and there's so many innovations coming out, new systems, new technologies, that for us to just kind of say, well, the answer that's been right for the past 3 years is still the right answer isn't necessarily good enough. And you know, it really does come down to diligence and thoroughness. And in this particular case, we ended up doing a review of 15 different energy systems and did detailed options appraisal on each and every one of them. And you know, we then presented that to some of our project teams who had only done 2 options and hadn't looked at any of these other ones. So we ended up coming to a different conclusion as a result, and really improved the financial performance of our schemes. I'll just show you what that options appraisal looks like. So moving on to the next slide, we've got a communal air source heat pump with a gas boiler. So this provides a bit of a system overview, shows it, kind of illustrates it, and provides a list of carbon and cost figures. So, you know, in terms of, and SAP 10 is for those who aren't aware, is just essentially carbon calculations based on the current carbon intensity of electricity. So electricity has a certain amount of carbon associated with it, and that would be kind of that indicator. So in terms of carbon savings, it, you know, achieves a reduction in carbon of 35% by implementing that system versus kind of your basic legally compliant system. But when you look at lifetime carbon emissions, that actually reduces it by 42%. So it's a slightly better outcome than when just thinking about the immediate term. And you know, I think that first goes to the point that we do need to be looking at lifetime carbon savings. You know, what makes sense immediately right in front of us doesn't necessarily make sense for the long term. So always something that we want to be looking towards. When you move on to heating only, so if we're just assuming that we're only heating buildings, that ends up translating to 15,200 as the capital cost, and then we've got a much higher lifetime cost, obviously another 7K roughly. But when you add in heating and cooling, the jump is quite significant. So we're obviously trying to deal with and mitigate the effects of climate change. There's a lot of challenges around minimizing overheating in flats in London, and you know, also in many cities around the world. And trying to get to grips with that while also coming up with a low carbon energy system can be quite difficult. So what we're trying to do here is understand what the profile is of adding in heating and cooling. And in this particular case, because of the type of the system, you basically have to add in a cooling system. So you're actively cooling the building, and that obviously has a carbon implication as well. Now, if we go on to the next one, and I'll run through the next couple fairly quickly, but because it really shows the point of difference. But when you look at this one, this is a communal air source heat pump systems, or sorry, we've gone to the ground source now. So if we're on the ground source heat pump system, the ambient loop system, what this shows is that when you look at the immediate upfront carbon savings, we're going from 35% to 59%. And in terms of the lifetime carbon savings, we're going from 42 to 83. So really substantial jump in terms of carbon savings. And you know, if you put in an energy system like this, versus a building that's just built to basic policy compliance, you're reducing carbon by 83% across the building life cycle. That's huge. And the cost uplift isn't all that significant. I mean, if you look at the lifetime cost, for instance, of this system over the previous one we just looked at, that's an extra $3,000 roughly if you're dealing with heating only in terms of lifetime cost. And when you kind of look at that, you have to take a step back and say, you know, we're spending all this money on carbon offsets, all this money on energy efficiency measures. We're talking about, you know, $3,000 per home, with homes going for anywhere between, you know, 300 to 500,000 pounds, let's say. Is a, you know, 0.5% cost premium to reduce carbon emissions by 83% that significant? Not really, in the grand scheme of things. And of course, there's a whole host of other benefits that come with that. I'll touch on that a little bit later. Moving on, this is another system we considered, so an exhaust air heat pump. Again, slightly different profile. So you've got carbon savings that are a bit less than the last system, but the capital cost is a bit lower. So that kind of changes the calculus a little bit, and also provides a slightly different option. Something with very comparable performance, but a bit more cost effective. And that's actually the exhaust air heat pump, interestingly, is an option that didn't get considered by any of our project teams kind of as a default. So we, in doing these optimization briefs, introduced this system into the mix, introduced it into the thinking of the project teams, and it really did have a substantial impact, both in terms of the financial performance of our schemes, the carbon performance of our schemes, but also just about how we kind of did business and considered various energy strategies. So if we go on to the next page and we look at the summary table, this is kind of based on, you know, the immediate term. So, you know, looking at those SAP 10 carbon savings and the capital cost of everything. If you look at carbon emissions and what the best option is, that turns out to be the ground source heat pump. If you're looking at the cost of heating only, that then turns out to be a heat pump plus gas, with two of the more carbon efficient systems coming in at slightly more than $2,000 over that. And then when you look at the cost of heating and cooling, adding in cooling, you'll note that when you add in the cooling, which is, you know, increasingly being required to deal with overheating risk, the heat pump and gas is actually a lot more expensive than the other two options. So when you look at ground source heat pumps and exhaust air heat pumps, you've got 19,000 and 17,000 respectively, and that's for heating and cooling. And the reason for that is that some of these systems, they operate almost like a refrigerator pump. But what you can do is you can basically flick a switch that sends it going in the opposite direction, and it cools instead of heats. Whereas with things like gas, you have to put in a gas-based system, and you have to put in a second system that does the cooling. So it can actually be a lot more effective if you're having to, you know, put cooling in to deal with heat waves, for example. And that's obviously something that we're going to be having to be mindful of. Now, moving on to the second page, the second summary table. This is looking at life cycle cost, and that includes all those systems again. If you look at life cycle carbon, that turns out to be a ground source. That again is the same from the immediate term view. When you look at life cycle cost, interesting, it changes from heat pumping gas to exhaust air heat pump. And then when you look at the life cycle cost of heating and cooling, again, this goes up quite a bit, but the ground source heat pump becomes the most attractive. So overall, when you start looking at all this, that leads to the conclusion that, you know, yes, when you look at upfront cost, the heat pump and gas is you know, makes the most sense. It's the cheapest solution. But if we go on to the next slide and just kind of come to the end conclusion here, the bottom line is that, you know, the hybrid of heat pumps and gas, which is basically the scraping by policy, bare minimum, we want to save money option, that, you know, was in fact recommended to us by pretty much every QS we've worked with. It only makes sense when you look purely at the upfront capital cost and when we completely ignore the issue of overheating. So if we make the assumption that, you know, our occupants don't care about roasting in the summer, and we make the assumption that you know, we don't need to care about longer term costs to our portfolio, and just want to look at the here and now with, disregard to other wider issues, such as, comfort of our occupants, that option makes sense. And unfortunately, what happened is that, our profession looked at that upfront cost. We didn't consider the lifetime implications of those decisions. We didn't consider that wider impact. And we received a recommendation quite consistently to go with an option that didn't actually make sense if we want to be a long-term business with long-term healthy revenue streams and want to mitigate against the risk of climate making our assets stranded. So we got advice that was basically incorrect. And this is just one example of many that I could give of where our profession hasn't necessarily wrapped its head around the life cycle implications of what we're recommending. We haven't thought long term. We're just saying, what is the upfront cost of this, and our recommendations based on that. And we don't think more holistically. We don't think in the wider term. And another good example of this, for example, is home quality mark. So we went to a QS and we asked, if we implement home quality mark, is that a good idea? And we got advice back saying that implementing home quality mark is going to cost £12,000 more than kind of a base build and what you're proposing, and it doesn't add any value, so we advise against it. We went and did off the back of that piece of advice a lot more research and kind of looked at how are we actually performing. And as it turns out, our scheme was already achieving the HQM criteria. So there was actually no additional cost because we were already doing it, albeit by accident. And that just goes to illustrate that, the diligence piece and really thoroughly understanding these issues of sustainability and using that to inform our advice rather than just jumping to a conclusion very quickly based on cost benchmarks is really essential to making the right decision. BREEAM similarly, cost consultants are all too happy to say how much BREEAM outstanding is going to cost, but they never turn around and say, oh, and by the way, you're going to reduce your operating expenses, you're going to reduce your vacancy rates, you're going to lease up faster, you're going to get a better rate on the market. And by the way, you should add all those factors into your development appraisal when deciding whether the cost is worth it. And again, that goes back to the point about thinking holistically, thinking in the interest of our clients. And that's just an example of how viability calculus has really changed. And our profession kind of needs to step up to the plate. We need to understand how that change has happened, what it means for us, and make sure that what we're advising our clients on is in line with a comprehensive understanding of sustainability and current information that we are actively seeking out and thinking critically about. Because if we continue to just make assumptions about what stacks and what doesn't, we continue to just kind of use old cost benchmarks to tell our clients what should happen in the future that don't necessarily remain true. That's going to undermine our fight against climate change. It's going to, kind of work against the social impact that our industry is trying to have, and it's ultimately going to undermine our financial returns. That's something that I really have kind of encouraged our supply chain to take on board, and indeed us to take on board within TfL. We're very, very keen to think for the long term, and we're firmly of the view that doing so makes financial sense. We want to generate a long-term, sustainable, robust revenue stream to help reinvest into the transport network. So we are as commercial, as any other entity, but we also recognize that driving social impact, environmental stewardship, all those things can actually add to our bottom line and are also just the right thing to do. And that's why we've taken that approach. So hopefully that was a bit of a useful overview of our approach and some case studies of how that's kind of deployed in practice, as well as what that kind of implies for our profession. I'm a chartered surveyor myself, and of course I'm very keen to see our ICS members really kind of lead the way on this issue, and I think that we can. The sector looks to our ICS chartered surveyors to provide quality advice on navigating the issues related to property, and we're in a very powerful position to be responding to all the challenges that face us, whether it's climate change, COVID, what have you, through the built environment. And you know, I really hope everybody is kind of keen to support our clients, and if you are a client yourself, you know, your own organizations, really push that agenda forward. So I guess now we can jump on to the Q&A.
Eric, I just sent you a question in the chat box.
Ah, yes, thank you. Okay, perfect. That just popped up. So yeah, have or will COVID affect the forecast employment-based growth assumptions, and how does this affect TfL's plans? So it doesn't impact us too much, to be honest with you. The vast majority of our portfolio is residential development, so we're primarily focusing on homes, and the reason for that is one, because London has a housing crisis, and two, because you know, we're keen to help contribute towards solving that and generate a return out of that as well. We're actually delivering our portfolio at 50% affordable, so that's really part of our kind of social impact approach. You know, very keen to deliver affordable housing and help the city kind of address that issue. So our focus is very much on residential. We do have a couple of office developments that we're currently looking at. That being said, you know, we've got, I think, sufficient demand within the market to address those. And you know, TfL itself is a fairly substantial office occupier, and we're actually looking at potentially occupying a number of our own offices, or a number of our own developments ourselves. That's not confirmed, but you know, potentially something that we could look at. So at this point in time, it hasn't really influenced our thinking too much, just because the kind of quantum of office space we're proposing is relatively small, but it certainly will factor into our decision making going forward if we do decide to undertake, you know, a substantial amount of commercial development that gets to the point where those kind of questions come into play. Rob, thanks for the question. That's actually a really good question. That's a really good point. And yes, you're right. I mean, the reason we were able to challenge the recommendations made by our QSs is by doing our own research. Some of it is actually fairly easy to come up with. A lot of research is out there. Some of it's not terribly easy to find. And actually, Joe, this might be something for us to pick up, because we've compiled this kind of database almost of industry research that kind of illustrates the business case for various sustainability measures, and those are all public documents. They're just not necessarily, you know, easily visible to the private sector. So it might be worth us actually circulating those documents. I'm happy to provide them to the people in this group, and potentially indeed posting them on the RICS website, so everybody has access to them and making them a little bit more visible. So yeah, Rob, I mean, we did do our own primary research and kind of looking at things in addition to the stuff that's publicly available, and it did take a bit of work, and for smaller developers that, you know, might not be feasible. So, you know, with that in mind, I think the best way to do it, if you don't you know, have the detail of it and can't really effectively challenge them on the technical bits, what you can always challenge them with is you know, two key questions. One, have you considered the impact of what you're recommending on the lifetime of this project? Are there going to be consequences down the line that we need to be mindful of that you're not telling us or thinking about right now? What is the long-term implication of the decision you're advising us to take? And then the second question is really just about thinking holistically. So saying, okay, you've suggested we do this, or you've said the cost of doing this is that. What are the implications of that decision on other issues that we're wanting to push? So social impact, environmental sustainability, job creation, so on and so forth. I want to understand what the implications are kind of in that kind of broader sense. And I'd like to tell you what I want you to explain what we're potentially gaining or losing through what you're recommending with respect to those issues. And if you put the onus on them to explain their thinking about the life cycle and their thinking about how their recommendation impacts on environmental, social, economic sustainability, it puts them on the spot and kind of demands of them that they start looking at those issues. And if they don't have a good answer, if they start stuttering in the design team meeting and can't provide you with a good answer, you know, you immediately know that they haven't thought about these things, and it's time to go back to the drawing board a little bit. David Inman, do you use any specific standards? So we do have a series of standards on our operational estate, and yes, I mean, in terms of ISO standards, we deploy them variously across projects. It's not too easy to say, you know, whether we have unilateral standards across everything, because our assets are so varied. I mean, we've got, as I said, 2,000 properties, which range from railway arches to head offices to retail units to office units to you know, new property development. So the range of standards that we've got is really quite broad. But we do kind of consistently look towards the you know, the HQM and BREEAM systems to really support us. In terms of service life planning and life cycle costing, the answer is yes. So we actually use a range of different systems which are in line with the RICS guidance on life cycle costing and service life planning. So that's something we consistently do, and it's kind of business as usual for us. That being said, that is really applicable to the property development component of our property estate. We've got, as I said, a bunch of existing properties, and that's actually going to be a big challenge, is kind of looking at how do we start looking at the life cycle of these heritage and legacy assets that we've got and get those to a zero carbon position. So that'll be a very interesting one. So Robert, are you familiar with the UK Stewardship Code? I won't lie to you, I'm not. I haven't come across this before, but I'll be quite interested to read it. So thanks for sending that through. Yeah, so thanks, Nick. That is actually a really good question. I mean, one of the things we're considering is the need for additional amenity space. So for example, if everybody's working from home, do they need additional facilities within the development project to help them work from home? Oh, apologies, sorry. Apparently the audience can't see the question in the chat, so my apologies for that. Sorry, yes. So the question is, do you think it would be prudent for your residential developments to increase their square meter size to allow for the growing demand for increasing numbers of work from home buyers? So to answer that question, I mean, people won't necessarily be buying a home for the purpose of working from home. They'll just be buying it. So we don't expect there'll be an increased demand for home buying. But what the likely implication of that is that people are going to be in their homes more. They're going to need additional work facilities. So for example, if they need to do a conference call, if they need to have a breakout space where they can use whiteboards and that sort of thing, is it worth putting in communal facilities for people to make use of that? Or indeed, do the flats themselves need to be bigger so that you can accommodate workspace? And in both those cases, we're actively looking at that. I think it's definitely going to be a shift, but we also need to be mindful that while there has been a big shift to work from home, we are going to see a bit of a bounce back, because I think, I don't know about you, but personally, I would really like to get back to the office and see my colleagues again. And the degree to which people actually continue to work from home, I think, remains to be seen. So we don't really want to be making too many decisions at this point. It's something on the radar, and we're definitely considering it actively. Okay. If there are no other questions, I think that is it for today. So just want to say thank you to everybody for joining, and I'll follow up with Joe and see if I can get some documents sent out to everybody if you're interested, or we'll just post them on the website so you can download them at your leisure if you want, because there is a lot of really good research and documents out there about the business case for sustainable development. Some of them are very, very well worth reading. And for those of you who are looking to promote and increase financial returns, even if you don't care about environmental sustainability, they're worth looking at, because they will help you improve the financial performance of your projects. So definitely worth taking a look. So yeah, thank you. Hope that was useful, and all my best. Take care.